When Charlie Kirk was shot dead on the campus of Utah Valley University, the nation held its breath. Conservative activist, political lightning rod, shot from a rooftop by a single bullet while addressing students. But this isn't his story. This is the story of a father who watched the grainy surveillance footage on the news and recognized his own son. Tyler Robinson, 22 years old, electrician in training. Once described by friends as brilliant, reserved, kind. Now labeled by authorities as their prime suspect. The manhunt had begun. Utah's largest in years. FBI agents swarmed the area. State police cordoned off streets. News helicopters circled overhead. But before law enforcement could close in, a father's eyes caught what no computer algorithm could confirm. The slope of his son's shoulders. The tilt of his head. The distinctive walk of a child he had raised from birth. Picture this moment. A man sitting in his living room, coffee growing cold in his hands, watching the evening news. Then the footage appears. Security cameras captured a figure on the rooftop. Blurry, distant, but unmistakable to a father's trained eye. At first, complete denial. It couldn't be Tyler. Yes, he'd been quiet lately. Withdrawn. Yes, he'd grown more political in recent years. Yes, he'd mentioned disliking Kirk's views at dinner just days before. But a killer? A sniper on a rooftop? The idea seemed impossible to process. Then the evidence began whispering back piece by piece. That family dinner where Tyler specifically mentioned Kirk's upcoming visit to the university. The angry words they'd exchanged about politics. Text messages on Tyler's phone that mentioned a rifle at some hidden location. Each detail crashed down with crushing force. The realization hit like a freight train at full speed. He knew. Deep in his bones, he knew. His son had crossed a line with no way back. Now picture the father in those first hours after recognition. Pacing his kitchen. Hands shaking. Mind racing between disbelief and terrible certainty. Does he call police immediately? Does he warn Tyler? Does he pretend he saw nothing? The weight of the decision pressed down like a physical force. The choice came fast and brutal. Two paths stretched before him. Protect his son and shield him from justice. Help him disappear, maybe flee the country, live as fugitives together. Or act with integrity and turn in his own blood. Family loyalty against moral duty. Love against law. Both paths led to losing Tyler forever. But there was more to consider. If Tyler remained free, what would happen next? The potential for more violence lingered in the air like smoke. Other speakers. Other events. The father couldn't live with the possibility that his silence might cost more lives. Hours passed in agony. The father made his choice. He reached out to someone he trusted completely, a youth pastor who had guided their family through difficult times. This pastor also happened to work as a U.S. Marshals Task Force officer. Through this bridge between faith and law, Tyler would be convinced to surrender. The conversation between father and pastor lasted deep into the night. Plans were made. Words were chosen carefully. The approach had to be perfect. One wrong move and Tyler might run again, this time beyond reach. The pastor made contact. Tyler was hiding in the woods near Orem, exactly where his father thought he might be. The same forests where they'd hunted together years before. Where Tyler knew every trail, every hiding spot, every escape route. Tyler resisted at first. Denied everything. Claimed innocence. Refused to come in. His voice carried desperation mixed with defiance. But his father's words, delivered through the pastor, cut through the lies. The man who had baptized Tyler, who had counseled him through teenage doubts, spoke with quiet authority that couldn't be ignored. The conversation stretched for hours. Back and forth. Resistance and persuasion. Fear and faith. Slowly, Tyler's resolve began to crack. The weight of what he'd done, combined with his father's plea for surrender, finally broke through his denial. Tyler walked out of the woods. Hands raised. No weapons. No resistance. Into the arms of waiting law enforcement officers. The arrest made immediate headlines across the country. Cable news ran breaking news alerts. Social media exploded with reactions. The nation celebrated the efficiency of law enforcement and the cooperation of family and faith community. President Trump quickly issued a statement praising the capture, though his words carried heavy political overtones. He called for the death penalty and demanded a speedy trial. His language was sharp, divisive, focused on punishment rather than justice. Utah's governor struck a completely different tone. He urged calm, called for lowering the political temperature, reminded citizens that everyone deserved due process. He worried about vigilante justice and political violence spreading. Legal analysts immediately began debating whether presidential remarks would complicate the prosecution. Could public statements from the highest office influence jury selection? Would defense attorneys claim their client couldn't receive a fair trial? But beneath all the noise of politics and procedure, one man's quiet tragedy went completely unnoticed by the media circus. The father of Tyler Robinson had not only lost his son to the abyss of crime, but had also become the reluctant hand that delivered him to justice. This became his fate, his burden to carry. In the eyes of the public, he wasn't the shooter. He wasn't the man on the rooftop. He wasn't the name in bold headlines. He was the shadow figure behind the story. The man whose love had been forced to transform into duty. Now he had to live with that choice for the rest of his days. Attend family gatherings where Tyler's absence sat heavier than any silence. Walk past his son's childhood bedroom where memories of innocence clashed with knowledge of what he'd become. Face the dual reality that he may have saved lives by acting, while simultaneously condemning his son to life in prison, possibly even death. Friends and investigators spoke extensively about Tyler's transformation in recent years. Teachers remembered a different boy entirely. Once friendly, gifted, and intensely private, he had become hardened in his political views. Filled with rage. Consumed by the currents of polarization that swirled through American society like a toxic storm. His father, more than anyone else, had watched this transformation with growing alarm. Witnessed the gradual change. The quiet dinners that slowly turned into tense exchanges. Political discussions that became heated arguments. The boy who once dreamed of becoming an electrician, of building homes and wiring hope into communities, had instead slipped into the darkness of ideology and hate. For any father, the warning signs had been there. But they appeared gradually, almost imperceptibly. Like watching someone age, you don't notice the daily changes until suddenly they're completely different. The slope had been slippery, the descent so gradual that each step seemed manageable until it culminated in one irreversible act of violence. The rifle discovered in the woods told its own story to investigators. Wrapped hastily in a towel. Abandoned without care. No grand escape plan. No carefully plotted exit strategy. No blueprint for survival after the shooting. Tyler's actions bore all the hallmarks of impulsive rage rather than calculated terrorism. He wasn't a man prepared for martyrdom or lifetime commitment to a cause. He was simply a son who had committed an unthinkable crime and then ran home, back to the very city where his father lived, back to the one place where truth couldn't remain hidden forever. For the father, the hours between recognizing Tyler on the surveillance footage and seeing him led away in handcuffs must have stretched like centuries. What specific words did he use when he first confronted his son through the pastor? Did he plead with desperate tears? Did he command with parental authority? Did he break down completely, torn between basic parental instinct and crushing civic responsibility? What promises did he make during those agonizing negotiations? What prayers did he whisper in the darkness? What threats did he consider? The private conversation that convinced Tyler to surrender remains locked away, known only to three men bound by circumstances none of them had ever imagined. The choice the father made carries weight that most people will never understand. He chose to trust the legal system, to trust the pastor who bridged their worlds, to trust that justice, however brutal and final, represented the only path forward for everyone involved. In making that choice, he may have genuinely saved other lives. Had Tyler remained free and unaccounted for, the potential for additional violence hung in the air like a loaded weapon. But that knowledge did little to ease the heart of a man who had effectively delivered his own son to a trial that could very well end in execution. His fate became one of impossible contradiction. Quietly hailed as a man of honor by law enforcement officials who understood his sacrifice. Yet privately haunted every single day by the image of his boy sitting behind bars, aging prematurely in a concrete cell. The story of Charlie Kirk's assassination had been framed by media and politicians as a watershed moment in American history. Some called it the tragic end of a dark chapter in political violence. Others feared it represented only the beginning of something much darker and more destructive. But within that sweeping national narrative lay the quieter, more personal watershed of one man's completely transformed life. The father of Tyler Robinson had crossed into an entirely new existence. He was no longer simply a father. He had become a witness, a reluctant accomplice to justice, a man forever tied to both the victim and the perpetrator. His name might never appear in newspaper headlines or television cheer-ins, but his fate was tragic nonetheless. Tragic because he would never again hold his son without remembering the rooftop and the rifle. Never again hear Tyler's laughter without recalling the terrible silence that followed the gunshot. Never again see him as the innocent child of memory without also seeing him as the suspect in handcuffs. His entire relationship with fatherhood had been permanently rewritten. Rewritten by an act of violence that he didn't commit but somehow couldn't prevent. Every cherished memory now carried the weight of what came after. Prison visits became the rhythm of his new life, but they grew increasingly difficult as the years accumulated. The long drives to the correctional facility strained his aging body. His back stiffened during the journey. His hands cramped on the steering wheel. Some days he nearly turned around halfway, telling himself he was too tired, too sick, too emotionally drained to continue. But the thought of Tyler sitting in that sterile visiting room, glancing repeatedly at the clock, slowly realizing that his father wasn't coming, that image drove him forward every time. More than love, more than duty, it was guilt in its purest and most powerful form. Inside the prison walls, time seemed to stand completely still. Guards changed shifts and seasons. Procedures shifted slightly. But the space itself remained sterile and frozen in institutional amber. Tyler's face changed dramatically as the years took their relentless toll. His hair thinned and grayed prematurely. His shoulders slumped with the weight of confinement. His voice carried less fire and more bone-deep weariness. The father sometimes thought his son had grown old before his time, as though prison life drained years more quickly than the free world ever could. They spoke mostly of ordinary, safe things because the extraordinary circumstances of their relationship couldn't be spoken aloud. Weather reports. Cafeteria food quality. News from the outside world. They never spoke directly about the shooting itself. Never mentioned Charlie Kirk by name. Never discussed the trial proceedings or legal appeals. Those subjects remained off-limits by mutual, unspoken agreement. Too dangerous. Too painful. Too loaded with consequences neither man could bear to face directly. The father's own health began its predictable decline as he entered his 70s. His hands developed a persistent tremor when he signed his name. His chest felt heavy and constricted on cold mornings. Doctors prescribed various medications, monitored his blood pressure religiously, suggested more rest and less stress. He nodded politely at their advice, though he understood perfectly well that no medicine could cure what he carried inside. What weighed him down wasn't located in his blood or bones or organs. It lived deeper, in the place where soul meets conscience, where love wrestles daily with justice. Yet he clung to life with surprising tenacity. Perhaps out of duty to his imprisoned son. Perhaps out of fear of what lay beyond. Perhaps because leaving this world too soon would feel like abandoning Tyler to face his punishment completely alone. The father had become his son's only regular visitor, the sole remaining connection to life outside the walls. Old age brought an entirely different kind of prison sentence. Memory and present reality no longer stood apart as separate things. They overlapped constantly, bled into each other, tangled into something inseparable and confusing. Each morning he woke with the same physical ache, not just in his bones but deep in his spirit, as though grief had grown into a second skeleton inside him, simultaneously holding him upright and weighing him down. He had grown accustomed to the particular rhythm of his loneliness. The house felt smaller every year, stripped of the noise and energy that families naturally create. Rooms remained unused for months at a time, like silent witnesses to a life that had effectively ended years ago. Dust gathered in places where movement and activity once stirred the air. Chairs sat permanently empty at the dining room table. Each vacant seat served as a reminder of meals never shared, conversations never had, holidays never celebrated together. Sometimes he left the television running throughout the day, not because he cared about the programs, but simply for the sound of human voices filling the oppressive silence. But even background noise couldn't drown out the memories that played on endless repeat in his mind. He saw Tyler everywhere in that house. In the creak of the stairs, he heard the heavy footsteps of a teenager coming home late from work or friends. In the backyard, he could picture a younger version chasing fireflies on summer evenings. In the garage, he almost glimpsed him tinkering with tools, clumsy but curious about how things worked. But when he blinked or turned his head, the illusions vanished completely. The boy of memory was always replaced by the harsh reality of a man locked away behind concrete and steel, aging prematurely in a world of violence and desperation. Loneliness settled into his daily routine like a permanent houseguest who never leaves. Old friends gradually moved away, grew too old for regular contact, or simply died off one by one. He attended more funerals than birthday parties. Some friends simply drifted out of his life, not from cruelty but from the natural awkwardness that surrounds tragedy. Social encounters became careful negotiations between who he had been before and who he was forced to be now. Every conversation carried the potential for uncomfortable questions or meaningful silences. People either avoided mentioning Tyler entirely or asked probing questions he couldn't answer. He began writing in composition notebooks during the long evenings. Page after page of rambling passages addressed to no one in particular. He wrote about Tyler's childhood, about fate and choice and responsibility, about whether love should survive even when it has been betrayed by unthinkable violence. He never showed these pages to anyone. They accumulated in desk drawers, yellowing with time, becoming the silent record of a man desperately trying to understand something fundamentally incomprehensible. The notebooks became his confession, his therapy, his attempt to make sense of senseless tragedy. Even as he began preparing mentally for his own death, his heart remained completely tethered to his son. He wondered if Tyler would be allowed to attend his funeral, if prison officials would grant that final mercy. He wondered who would speak his name kindly at the service, who would remember him apart from the shadow of tragedy. He imagined death not as an escape from suffering, but as the closing of a circle, the final chapter of a story he had never asked to be written. Even then, even facing his own mortality, Tyler remained his primary concern. The love of a father, tested by the worst possible circumstances, somehow endured. The most unbearable weight of all proved to be exactly this: loving someone whom the rest of the world could never forgive. Carrying that love like a wound that refused to heal, a burden that grew heavier rather than lighter with each passing year. In the twilight years of his life, the father existed in a space where memory and current reality had stopped being separate things entirely. They overlapped constantly, bled into each other, created a tangled mess of past and present that he could no longer untangle. Each morning brought the same spiritual ache, not just in his aging bones but in the deepest part of his being. Grief had literally become a second skeleton inside him, holding him upright while simultaneously weighing him down with unbearable heaviness. The house continued shrinking around him. More rooms fell into disuse. More surfaces gathered dust. More silence replaced the sounds of normal family life. He moved through the space like a ghost haunting his own former existence. Sometimes he would sit in Tyler's old bedroom, surrounded by artifacts from a different time. Trophies from high school. Tools from his electrician training. Photos of friends and family from before everything changed. The room had become a museum to innocence lost, a shrine to the boy who had somehow become a killer. Prison visits required more effort as his body continued failing. The drive seemed longer each time. His vision wasn't as sharp. His reflexes had slowed. His hands cramped painfully on the steering wheel. Several times he nearly turned around halfway, telling himself he was too sick, too tired, too emotionally exhausted to continue. But the image of Tyler waiting in that visiting room, checking the clock, slowly realizing his father wasn't coming, that possibility drove him forward every single time. It wasn't love that motivated these trips anymore. It was something deeper and more complex. Guilt, duty, and fear all mixed together into an obligation he couldn't abandon. Inside the prison, the environment never changed. New guards replaced old ones. Policies were modified slightly. But the fundamental character of the place remained frozen in institutional time. Tyler's appearance continued evolving in ways that broke his father's heart. More gray hair. Deeper lines around his eyes. A permanent stoop in his shoulders from years of concrete and confinement. The father sometimes thought prison life drained vitality faster than normal aging ever could. His son looked decades older than his actual years. Worn down by routine, by violence, by the constant stress of survival in a dangerous environment. Their conversations grew shorter and more superficial as the years passed. They discussed weather, food, minor news from the outside world. They carefully avoided anything related to the shooting, the trial, the appeals process, or the possibility of execution. Those topics remained permanently off-limits by mutual understanding. The father's physical health continued its steady decline. His hands shook when signing documents. His chest felt tight on humid days. His memory started playing tricks on him. Doctors prescribed more medications, ordered more tests, suggested lifestyle changes he was too old and tired to implement. He nodded at their advice while knowing that traditional medicine couldn't touch what actually ailed him. The sickness in his soul had no cure, no treatment, no hope of recovery. It was a terminal condition that would only end with his death. Yet he persisted in living, driven by forces he didn't entirely understand. Perhaps duty kept him going. Perhaps fear of what came next. Perhaps the simple fact that dying would mean abandoning Tyler to face his fate completely alone. The father had become his son's only connection to the outside world, the sole reminder that someone still cared about his existence. As his final years approached, the father began to understand that his story would never have a satisfying conclusion. There would be no redemption, no healing, no moment when everything made sense. His fate was to carry this burden until his death, to love someone the world could never forgive, to live in the space between justice and mercy where neither provided comfort. This is not a story about politics or ideology or movements. This is not even ultimately a story about Charlie Kirk, though his death remains the tragic center around which everything else revolves. This is the story of a father who lost his son not once but twice. First to the currents of anger and political rage that reshaped Tyler into someone unrecognizable. Then to the cold, impartial machinery of justice that claimed him for punishment. It's the story of a man who will carry forever the crushing weight of a choice that was really no choice at all. A decision between two equally unbearable paths. A moment when love and duty collided so violently that neither emerged intact. The tragic fate of Charlie Kirk's shooter's father wasn't that he made the wrong choice. It was that the right choice was completely indistinguishable from heartbreak. And he must now live in its shadow for every remaining day of his life. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the human side of true crime. Hit that notification bell and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in his position? The stories behind the headlines matter. Don't let them be forgotten.